Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this panel on crowdsourcing. And I've got to say, when we were walking in through the elevator and saw the sign, World Bank Conference on Understanding Risk, and then see the word crowdsourcing, honestly, is not something I expected to see at the World Bank or any other big organization anytime soon. So this is very much a forward-thinking panel that we're bringing to the conference, and there are no right or wrong sort of questions or answers for that matter, and we hope that you're going to engage with us because this is going to be more of a workshop or a brainstorming session than just a broadcasting session. I'm actually going to stop there with the introductory remarks. If you saw the introduction yesterday in the Ignite talks, basically looking at how crowdsourcing can be applied to risk assessments. There are definitely some, I think, advantages that we're going to talk about, but there's a lot of hype, and we're going to try and cut through some of that. So I've got three awesome panelists here who I referred to quite rightly yesterday as Mavericks. They're going to live up to that title and tell you a bit more about what they think in terms of their own professional experience. Crowdsourcing can be leveraged in the context of what the World Bank is doing on disaster risk reduction and so on. I will let them introduce themselves very briefly, and the way this is going to work is they're each going to give a 10-minute presentation. We're going to hold all questions till the end of all three presentations, and then we'll just have an open conversation. So we're not going to be writing down any sort of questions or anything, but we're basically going to have a back and forth openly. So I'll hand it over. We're probably going to start with Nigel, I believe, and then we'll have John and then Brett. Nigel, if you just want to stay here for now, you each give an introduction to who you are, and then we'll take it from there. Thanks.
Hello, my name's Nigel Snowd. I have a day job at Microsoft where I effectively research and try and understand how community resilience might be assisted or built using social networking tools and other kinds of sort of open interactive media. The evening jobs multiply. I work for the ICT for Peace Foundation as an advisor. I work for the UN occasionally. I was just down in Haiti as part of the UNDAC response team, and I've got several years' experience doing mostly disaster response, but thinking quite extensively about how communities factor into that.
My name is John Crowley. I've turned those nights and weekend job into a day job, and now I have all day, night, and weekend working on the same thing. My job right now is as a catalyst and a facilitator between open source communities. I work in two places right now. I work with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, which is the humanitarian wing of Harvard University. And then I work with the Star Tides Initiative, which is a work in progress at the National Defense University, founded by the former CIO for the Department of Defense, in looking at how can we help military understand how to do things a little differently, shall we say. I guess there's probably enough for this.
Hi, my name's Brett Horvath, and I'm with Revision Products. There's also Revision Labs, two different divisions. One designs products built around crowdsourcing and collaborative technologies. The other is a consulting operation. But we really look at large-scale collaborative approaches to helping organizations work outside their own boundaries or between other organizations, and things like microfinance, what's being referred to as Government 2.0, but also figuring out how do you mobilize at large scales, get 100,000 people, 1 million people working on a problem or a solution. And so I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Do you want to get ready? So just, I guess, I should probably say a few things about myself. So my name is Patrick. I'm with a group called Ushahidi, and we develop these platforms that are often used for crowdsourcing crisis information and mapping that type of information. I'm also the co-founder of the International Network of Crisis Mappers. I was formerly with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, where I co-founded and directed the program on crisis mapping. And let's see. We'll hand it over to Nigel.
Me 3 Apple computers. Yeah. Just go.
In which case it would be
PowerPoint. Hang on, here we are.
that you.
Yep. And present. So as the first speaker, which is something we just decided a second ago, I've got to both introduce a little bit more beyond what Patrick said last night about what we each think about crowdsourcing, and then try and sort of point off to where these guys are going to take off. One of the challenges is that crowdsourcing is such a new concept, as described at least, that we've each got different interpretations of it. And really every community that comes at it and pulls together in an open way with an open call to action often gets described as a crowdsourced community. So I'm just going to start by trying to talk a little bit about how we might view it in the context of risk assessments. This is a fairly classic voting model. It's not a voting model, it's a market model of how we might sort of imagine, or how the financial community at least, and the innovation community imagines how crowdsourcing works. You have a bunch of invited experts, or even slightly more open, who put their money, figuratively, more often than literally, where their mouth is, make forecasts and predictions, and that somehow magically via the market mechanisms of this supposedly perfect market, we emerge with a consensus or a vote that tells us something predictive about the future. And that allows us to judge risks, hedge, and do all the standard things. That's great. It's really important and useful, but this community of experts idea is not what we're going to talk about. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how it matters that we start to link it in. This is more the crowd that we're going to talk about. And for Pablo in the audience, this is still from your video from Senegal, which is a community taking part in a collaborative risk assessment as a game. It's just an illustrative example, but one of the challenges we have is how do we broaden the notion of this community of experts to include those who are usually covered by our concept of a community risk assessment? And can we use tools to do that? So this is just another view from the Haiti 4636, which I think will be talked about a little bit more later, which was the recent sort of integration of a bunch of different technologies from groups like Instead, from Ushahidi and others, and Crowdflower, to collaboratively try and sort through messages from the field on the ground in Haiti during a crisis, or after a crisis, I should say. So it's not preparedness, but this is the breadth of the diaspora and others that worked on this problem. So the call to arms that might have been very focused on one area went very broad. It involved an unexpectedly broad community and the resources that they were able to bring to bear. These are not the group of people that you would have got if you'd selected a market of experts or if you'd selected a community for a community risk assessment. I'll just posit that's actually really important when we're starting to think about how risk assessments might be done in a more collaborative fashion, an open fashion. So I'll put the difference between these two views of crowdsourcing or collaborative risk assessment, if you like, down to saying, as Patrick had introduced it, it's really about a call to action and an open process. And I contrast that with a group of curated participants, which might actually be the village in question. If you want to do a community risk assessment, it might actually be a more broader academic or set of risk experts who know what sort of the hazards and the risks are and what they might mean. And as in the video that Pablo had, I mentioned that Pablo had made in Senegal, which we did with the Parsons, the New School for Design, bringing together the community and the experts, in this case meteorological experts, gives you a bunch of really unexpected outcomes that you wouldn't have thought you'd get with just one of them. I'll come back to that if I get time. This is breaking all the rules of the slide because they're way too small, the content. But I just wanted to highlight some of the things that any good behavioral economist knows, which is that individuals and communities have errors of judgment that skew exactly what you get out of a risk assessment, out of a voting model. The concept of the market is, of course, that it'll somehow smooth over these errors of judgment. But as we've seen recently, that's not always the case. So I think some of the key things that come out that apply to both of these crowdsourcing issues that really matter and affect how the outcomes work is a couple of things. So I'll highlight this one down towards the bottom, which is that costs aren't actually accounted for properly. If you try and incentivize people by getting them to bet fake or real money, people don't account for numbers properly when they do these exercises. They skew them. They optimize for future reward. They favor that. They discount for hazards. Right? They discount future costs and benefits. There's a couple of other things that come out of the risk community, of course, which is that we're swayed by overly specific threats and scenarios. So I put it that when we start putting out what are the things that we start requesting input on what hazards might be approaching a community, the authors have an incredible ability to sway what the crowd and the community thinks about it. So if you wrote an overly specific threat, people are going to dive into that. It's the Schneider's movie threat plot, basically how to blow up an airliner. gets an incredible amount of attention, but it's actually the most ridiculous and unlikely thing to have happen when traveling or for terrorist threat. Okay. Second thing, which is really about diversity, which is the way to combat some of these problems, is actually to have a diverse and open argument around these questions and to make sure there is diversity. Forgive the typography, but basically the key thing comes from a friend of mine, Scott Page, which is that in a lot of his economic work, the diverse groups clearly outperform groups selected purely from the best and the brightest. So if you think that your market that is created from the best and the brightest, as intelligence markets might originally have been founded, it's outperformed by those that include a more diverse group of characters. I think what we're all arguing here is that if you extend that down to a broader crowd, that we're going to get a more diverse group. And particularly if that crowd includes the communities that are affected themselves, we start to get really at something that's capable of covering the range of threats and hazards that a community faces. So I'll put it up just schematically as something like this. The challenge to us is how do we blend the knowledge and wisdom and locality of community risk assessments with the expertise and the judgment, if you like, of those expert markets or of groups of individuals doing more traditional assessments with the knowledge and the breadth and the diversity of a crowd. And let's be frank, we have no idea. Actually, we have a few ideas. We've got based on experiences. But our ideas about how to put them into practice aren't really based on extensive experience. Most of the experience on crowdsourcing comes from either the markets I mentioned or comes from crisis and disaster response, which is a very different kind of thing from preparedness. So a couple of examples about how we might blend them. This is Instead's RIF tool, which is a collaborative sense-making situational awareness tool. This is an example of work in the Mekong Delta, H1N1 outbreaks, I believe. Yep. So it's a bunch of different feeds and information. It has a pile of machine learning and other strategic tools, plus a bunch of people voting on how to do and judge different threats and different inputs. It's a brown early warning, which is a different thing from risk assessment, but the platform and concepts are clear. Or Ushahidi's Swift River, which is basically how do we generate a filter that is collaboratively generated in and of itself, which seems like a nice recursive idea and allows us to sort of vote and make judgments on what comes through. Both of these technologies are really new in the open community, I'll put it that way. I'll put up one that mightn't be thought of quite the same way, which is that this is a classic, this is LinkedIn's Q&A section. Right? This is your community of experts, i.e. the people you know through your network, responding to questions that you have. So whether it's a Yahoo Q&A answer session or a more open thing, it doesn't really matter, but the concept is that we have something here that allows people to vote and contribute and have a discussion. So I'll really leave it with the key questions for me, which is that we're really lacking a good knowledge about what the incentives are to get communities, these different communities, to participate. Right? Is it money, fiction or real? How do we actually drag that down to the local level? There's a lot to be said about community stature, and the folks coming after me talk a lot about online communities, but I open the question about how we get local communities involved via cell phones or whatever mechanisms they have to vote or take part. And there are real disincentives. We could list them endlessly. And ultimately, it's about how we integrate this knowledge. How do we settle disputes? There's a list there, but I think it really comes down to the end. Who takes action is who wins. Right? Disputes are settled by the person who implements and spends money and does preparedness work, which is why, really in the end, it's this classic model about risk assessments to risk management that matters. I mean, however we do the assessments doesn't really matter. It does matter immensely, sorry, I should say, but we've talked about a couple of different ways. I'll put up this couple of key little bits in here that do affect what we crowdsource. Sorry, because I haven't really mentioned what information we're crowdsourcing through these different methods, and my red flag's about to come up in a second. Right? There it is. The hazard identification, the scenarios, the risks are clearly things that we crowdsource. We can both crowdsource the knowledge the items themselves, and we can crowdsource the voting, the weighting of those risks and hazards. But we can also crowdsource the actions, right? And weight those actions in a lot of different ways. But as I said, ultimately it's the community that makes those decisions. And of course the other piece is the baseline data. The more eyeballs we have on buildings, infrastructure, the more knowledge we have to feed into these different funnels and filters. And ultimately, ultimately it's about folks like these who I ran a workshop with in Afghanistan 2 years ago now, who are the ones who are mattering. Well, hopefully not just these folks, but their wives and their children and everybody else. Thank you.
Patrick, which way you got it? There we go. So I'm going to pick up a little bit of where Nigel left off, which is looking at what this new era of response means. We've talked a little bit about a new era of catastrophe. I think after Haiti, we may be talking about a completely different way of looking at providing reach-back support to responders, and at the same time creating a very different relationship to the affected population. One thing that we should maybe step back and look at the tsunami. Baseline information was something that Nigel just mentioned. Core to this is imagery. During the tsunami, it was very hard for the people on the ground to get good imagery. Even though it had been processed, and I know a few folks who had done that, it didn't reach the ground. There were also some policy issues that prevented even the imagery that was on the ground from being disseminated widely. It prevented a great deal of information from flowing, including understanding where the bridges were down and understanding how that routing would affect logistics. In Haiti, we waited 1 day. Digital Globe came out, released imagery within 27 hours. The UNISAT did phenomenal work, and I also have to compliment the World Bank for within the first 2 weeks got aircraft flying and giving us levels of imagery that are switched from seeing 1 meter data to seeing 15 centimeter and sometimes less in terms of resolution. That fundamentally changed the response. This baseline data is what enabled the crowd to do something very special. There's another set of baseline data that I just want to set up before I bring into the looking at what the crowd did. For the first time, we got texts from the rebel. We ended up seeing texts coming in via SMS messages through the systems that set up by a number of heroic individuals. And they basically set up a system for translating information. Patrick, your team up at Fletcher activated within an hour of the earthquake. Students aggregated in his apartment, ended up setting up a system with one of the major unions in the United States for translating from Creole to English, and then geolocating these tweets, these SMS messages and Facebook messages, and they started feeding them into a system that was entirely unaccustomed to getting this type of information from a crowd. OpenStreetMap took Haiti from something which was just done with major roads and started aggregating volunteers who poured into the system. OpenStreetMap is essentially a geospatial wiki. It's a place where people can collaborate in space in the way that we traditionally think about a wiki as collaborating through words. People can put concepts in place, can start tagging it, can start categorizing it, and what they did was to start filling in all of Haiti. They mapped a country in 2 weeks. I think this animation may show just the power of this. There were over 1,000 unique contributors to making a map of Haiti. Watch what happens here. You can watch over 1 million edits being made over 2 weeks. IDP camps traced. These are roads being mapped. This went from one of the poorest mapped countries in the world to being comparable with Germany as one of the best mapped countries in the world because of 1,000 volunteers. This is the collective intelligence that we're talking about. This is the power of the crowd. Imagery, this baseline data is what enables the collective action. What we need is an SMS infrastructure. We need some method of getting imagery to a crowd, a releasable imagery, and we need some method, some place to collaborate. And mostly that's in some place in space and in time. We need a geospatial wiki, which OpenStreetMap has served that purpose. Now, because of the number of players involved, you're seeing an incredible amount of coordination and a number of different activities. This just begins to look at some of the organizations in terms of pathways and what projects they began to work on. Now, this crowd made a huge difference in terms of entrapment data, in terms of feeding actionable information into the institutions that were on the ground. That said, they had some serious problems. Crowds discovered that they have carrying capacities. They are not simply a bunch of volunteers who come together and have unlimited resources. They are not that large. They are at a point where the carrying capacity is really a function of their expenses. Let's face it, many of us had, it's a difficult family situation. You're allocating all of your nights and weekends, and sometimes your employer is just giving you the permission to use your day job or deploy. You're not on salary to do this. These crowds are not maybe professionals in what they do, but they're not disaster responders. You also encountered issues of ethics. As we put all of this open data up on the web, what data are we putting up there? In some cases, it contains a great deal of personally identifiable information. As you saw from the text before, it had a name, it had a phone number, and it had an address where the person was trapped. What does this mean in other contexts than Haiti, where we're dealing with post-conflict, where we're dealing with possible pre-genocide activities? How do we begin to think through the ethical implications of open data? We also discovered, as a crowd, that bureaucracies are not set up in order to ingest this information. While it may be very smart, and while the information may be better than anything that's available, sometimes by orders of magnitude, the organizations are not set up with vetting processes so that they can understand how to make this information actionable inside of their own processes. This has proved to be the biggest sticking point for getting crowds funded. Now, institutions have some very valid wishes as well. They're trying to figure out, how do we get a single point of contact in these communities? How can you activate it and make sure that it's reliable? And how can you make sure that you can get money to it? And how can you make sure that what they do meets the need? So what if these communities that are now still ad hoc actually got some resources? Could we make them rechargeable in a sense? Deplete them in a surge capacity and then have them run in some other circumstance? How do we make them something that would be reliable, setting up methods for reaching them in communication and making sure that we can get through our work responsibly? We had a meeting in Camp Roberts, which is one of the experimentation programs that I run, a few weeks ago, where we discussed the concept of actually having to create a consortium of the institutions and the crowds that came together around Haiti and around other disasters to look at how could we set up minimum standards for making this type of activity possible? How can we make it up so that we have an ethical code of conduct? How can we set it up so that everyone in the large institutions understands who to talk to, who to activate during a disaster? How do we set it up so that there's a contracting vehicle so that UN, Department of State, DFID, other people can actually reach out to the organization and give them top off some kind of existing contract? How can we make sure that there are standards in place so that the data that we're providing is done in a common protocol and people understand how to interact with it? Can we credential some of the volunteers that have come together who may not necessarily have training to go into the field, may not be set up to do deployments? Can we get them so that they at least have some minimal set of credentials? And then how can we look at monitoring and evaluation so that we all learn from every single interaction? This quest is going to take us some time. We have a long, long way to go. We proved that we can do something fundamentally different. We proved that the crowd has a great power and capacity, but how we harness it and how we make this sustainable is still an open question. Thank you.
All right, I am going to go pretty quickly through this and might skip over a few of my slides and really like to engage some of the other speakers, but I want to take a step back and really try and put some frames around what crowdsourcing is. I think what both of the speakers have brought up is that it's not just a tactic to deploy, but it's actually how do we bring this into organizational approaches, program development, and decision-making mindset. And I say, how is community organizing can increase capacity? This is not about grassroots. I think people like us that try and do things at scale confuse the term community with, oh, we need something bottom-up, something like that. That's not what this is about. Community organizing is an organizational approach to how to get the most out of your capacity and how leadership operates. Let's see, we've got a formatting trigger on here. Patrick, do you have any idea of what's going on now? Okay. Let's see. Do we have any font? Okay, I'll just roll with it. So the three things I want to cover is the top is the importance of time, place, and trust. These are the most important aspects of data in crowdsourcing. The second is to identify, map, and amplify communities. These are the three things you need to take. And then the third is that open data and open APIs are critical to make this whole thing work. Now, when the term crowdsourcing first entered the literature in 2005, I liked the ideas, but I had this violent reaction against it. Management and leadership kind of, when they got to a sticky point, they'd say, oh, let's just crowdsource it, with no real understanding of what it meant, what the actual implications of it would be. And for me, it's about you need to identify and amplify the communities in the crowd. And I think that Nigel brought up a really good distinction is that there's the open process in the crowd and then experts. Now, I don't think it's an either or. Crowdsourcing is more of a process, an open approach that you can project your coordination. Chris Rasmussen, who's one of the minds behind Intellipedia, the intelligence community's kind of wiki social media approach, he said, the CIA, for everything except the most sensitive piece of information, should be working out in the open. It's not that you don't turn to your experts. They'll come along, but you open up for the emergence of new leaders, new expertise, and new capabilities. And so it's not an either or. You can do both. Really quick, I'll run through, there's been a revolution about 2 months ago in the Republic of Kyrgyzstan, and Revision Labs has been helping the new government think through crowdsourcing and approaches to government 2.0. But with the violent interactions in the streets, it was clear that no one knew quite what was going on. And so the interim government, journalists, NGOs had to work with the crowd and had to work as quickly as possible to increase its capacity, and no one knew quite what was going on. The revolutionary forces used things like Twitter, et cetera, to get into power, but then information accuracy really became important. And in that case, and this is one place where Patrick and I diverge a little bit, is that I think that we're going to see more and more a problem of information accuracy with crowdsourcing, that people will be gaming these systems. Anytime there is political or economic interest at stake, people will be using data as a weapon in a distributed, coordinated way. That's what we found in Kyrgyzstan. We had the U.S. with its air base and then Russian influences, and that was it was really hard to find out what's true and what's not. And that's why thinking about crowdsourced data, it's time, place, and trust. You have to be able to have reputation metrics. You have to be able to know what's the trust and the context of the information you're getting. Well, how do you build that? This is a slightly offensive picture one of my collaborators sent me when saying, if you're going to design a network, you have to take into account reputation. And when institutions collapse or they can't confront the crisis, if new partnerships need to be formed, social bonds and community is the only resource. Who can you trust? Who can you turn to when something comes up, when there's an earthquake in Haiti or a tsunami? And this is really about the intersection of real-time data, of social software, and community leadership. How do you get that social infrastructure that says, I can trust these people, I can work with them in an open way to get the most actionable intelligence?
This is an example in Australia where the government was able to work with an NGO to kick up the site Brushfire Housing that said, look, we want to broker people that have excess housing and people that need it that are displaced by fires. This is a great example of saying, okay, we know who we're going to trust and the amount of information we're going to put out there. But like the other two speakers brought up, this is getting beyond flash communities. This is about organizing and how do you take these approaches into organizational philosophy. This guy right here is Marshall Gaines. He is an organizational theorist from Harvard. He was the architect of the organization of the 2008 Barack Obama presidential campaign. He was an organizer with Cesar Chavez and has been a big proponent of community organizing as a leadership approach. And what that means is it's not just grassroots storytelling, but how do you have distributed leadership increase capacity? How do you push power to the edges in a way that actually increases what you can do? He's actually got a great online course that anyone can watch. I recommend it. This is about cultivating leadership in the networked age. If you want your organization, your NGO, to have increased capacity, you've got to take these approaches to distributed leadership. And now an example of this in the States is I'm working on a project with Code for America with actually Anish Chopra and Vivek Kundra, the federal CIO, that says, okay, there's been a large increase in neighborhood watch groups throughout the country from up to 23,000. And these are people out there that have social infrastructure. They've built up trust in their neighborhoods. And so how do we connect those with emergency response authorities? How can they send back and forth geo-targeted crime alerts? How can they say, these are problems in my area, using social software, using networked approaches? But not all those lessons can be overlearned from the U.S. I'm also the co-founder of a microfinance organization called Lumana that's based out of Ghana. And we try and take innovative ICT and community organizing approaches. And every village we go to that we distribute loans, the first thing we do is a community leadership assessment. A 95-point indicator say, who are the people in this community that we can trust? How can we activate them, both in a paid and volunteer capacity, and how do we map the relationships between those? And so when a flood happened in 2009, we had immediate capabilities and knew who could we trust, who could we turn to. And in that case, it provided not just increased capacity, but a marked advantage. Because of the ability to map out community leadership, we were able to outperform the microfinance institutes in the region. So it's something that has a noticeable impact in your ability to accomplish your bottom line, whatever you're doing. But what this takes, and what the other two speakers have brought up, is that we need living data, living systems, and living infrastructure. This isn't about static maps. This isn't about one-time crowdsourcing. We need to replenish these communities. So, communities do have a carrying capacity. So how do you foster that collaboration? How do they work in a networked way? Part of that is actively mapping high priorities, communities, and relationships between them. The Deloitte Center for Edge Innovation has a great study going on. They're looking at how do you map ecosystems and say, what are the incentives between these organizations? How do they work together most effectively and operate in an ecosystem? This is an important part of crowdsourcing to say, what are the relationships between the entities and the network you're trying to work under? And if we want effective risk assessment, government, NGOs, and community groups need to be working with interoperable real-time data. This is an important part of the whole equation, and open data and open APIs are critical. I really have to commend the World Bank for its open data initiative. It's been a great step forward, but it is only the beginning. I come from what's called the Government 2.0 community that's been running very similar open data initiatives for a couple years. And the problem is that the World Bank's open data initiative is basically just a publishing of data catalogs. It's not really any kind of open processes in the way that data is created or cultivated. And until it gets to that point, it's not going to realize the promise of open data and open processes. It's really just, go and download these programs and build some apps on top of them. The World Bank, as one example, could take a leadership position and say, here is an open process for gathering this data, disseminating it, collecting it. But it's a good start. So with that, I think I'll close my talk. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Chefs. Really appreciate it. So just some quick takeaways of my own. Obviously not the most important per se topics or issues that came out, but things that I'm definitely going to be interested in thinking more about in terms of Nigel's talk, where he had the different Venn diagrams of community risk assessments overlapping with expert risk assessments, and then that third bubble being crowdsourcing risk assessments. Now, where those all overlap, how does one make sense of that data, statistically, analytically, and so on, I think is a question that still needs to be answered. John did a great overview on this issue of carrying capacity of these crowds, and also, quite importantly, how do these crowdsourcing initiatives interface with more formal institutions. I think that's going to be something we're going to have to continue looking at, and incredibly important, obviously, the sustainability. And then Brett, just closing up, pointing to the very real issue of trust networks. How do you identify these trust networks, allow for reputation in these kinds of systems, and then also, interestingly, also the idea of crowdsourcing response, allowing the crowd itself, by definition, the first responders, to help each other out. And then, obviously, the value, really like the distinction between open data and then open processes. So with that, I'd like to open it up. The rule is basically, please introduce yourself before your question. You have 60 seconds. We're going to have a red card for you after 60 seconds. Usually a question, more often than not, ends with a question mark. So please phrase your comments in question mark type situations. And we'll take 3 at a time, yeah? And I'll try and moderate them. So we've got 1, 2, can I get a third? Third, thanks.
Just as soon as you think you've figured out what to do in a crisis situation like an earthquake, where it's above ground, you have a crisis that's below ground. So I'd like all of you to at least comment briefly on what this means for what's going on in the Gulf, what you do if you weren't here and you were addressing that situation, or what you know that you can share with us about that. And second, I'd like to know your impressions of the proportions of men and women in this particular new movement. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Danny Marshall, California Earthquake Authority. When you were describing the situation in Haiti, you were describing sort of a rabidly ad hoc and incredibly functional kind of a deal that went all around the world unexpectedly. And as you began to talk about what was needed and what expectations were for the future, you began to talk about the kind of infrastructure that the non-ad hoc communities demand: corporateness, ethics, legalities, all that sort of thing. What do you lose? You weren't describing a broken system. You were describing a functional system. What would you lose if you decided to play the other game, the old game?
I'm Pablo Suarez with the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Center. I have to thank you for inspiring so much that is happening already. Some of their friends are going to Vietnam for free to help the Vietnamese Red Cross think about this stuff. As a member of this large family, I now realize the Red Cross is a crowdsourcing thing. It's an open call for everyone who wants it to reduce human suffering, 95% volunteers. But we're not thinking in that way. And there are reasons why institutions, and the Red Cross, I'm sure it's a small one compared to, say, governments or bigger ones, are very cautious of engaging in this because of the loss of control. What advice do you have for those like me who want to embrace this but are inside an institution that has a lot of inertia and has to, I mean, the evidence is quite irrefutable, but still, how do we go faster and deeper? Thank you.
So great. So very quickly, then, we had a question on the Gulf. What would you do? The question of gender in this space, gender balance. What would we lose if we played the old game in Haiti? And then, how do you deal with the loss of control?
Is this on? So I'll just kind of hop around. First on the BP question, I think the federal government has done a lot to get information out through social channels. Commend them for that. But I think it's also been inexcusable that the information was not demanded to be put out in an open format from the beginning. The first example is the amount of oil coming out. BP would say, oh, we think it's 5,000 barrels a day. But the process, how that conclusion was came to, was not open. Did not know how that came about. Didn't even have access to the video at the beginning. Where you had other scientists coming in and saying, no, this is much higher, much bigger damage. And so that's a perfect example where you could have used the wisdom of the crowd to say, what's the true damage? What's the true extent? And I think the federal government still isn't learning that lesson.
especially in damage as it's coming up, and that lack of informational awareness is really hurting the ecosystem of the Gulf and the economy. To the question about, aren't we just saying that these are the old models we need to go to? I think that's the point, is that it's not either or. The internet is not magic. We have learned that. And so the question is, what's the magic in the middle? And how do you learn lessons from both? And I think that's goes on the third question. Is if you're an institution and you're trying to overcome these barriers, you need to say, look, how does our operation work in a networked age? We have moved from the industrial to the networked age, and how you bring this into the institution. I think a big part of that is how do you organize within your own institution? How do you identify innovators and then organize them to drive change? But really making the business case for that innovation. What is going to be the cost savings? What's going to be the increased capacity? Because it's not just woo-woo exciting. And I think that's the challenge. But the more we get big institutions doing that, the more upside we'll realize.
So let me take the gender question first. I imagine that I don't have any data. I don't think any of us do, right? But it's going to be very broadly replicating the communications tools that we're using, right? Which are gendered in general, if I can say that. Perhaps not cell phones per se, but the way the internet is used, the way these technologies are used. So that's, like all these tools, it's a challenge. But one of the things that I have hope for is that by pushing it into to talk about risk assessments and moving it into community mobilization and community risk assessments processes, which are, when you look at the toolkits and the way they're run by groups like the Red Cross and others, right, are very gender sensitive and really know that it is women in communities as well as the rest of the community that matter for making that happen. So I think one of the challenges is clearly how we bridge the digital divide if we're talking digital tools into individuals, but also how that takes part of engaging the other members of the community who don't necessarily have access. On the Gulf, I might actually just leave the Gulf for a moment and go to the bit about how we bridge the institutional gap. When I was in Haiti and when I've been in a bunch of other emergencies, and thanks, John, for using my photo from the tsunami. But one of the things is not that even if you're aware of what's possible, even if you're aware that OpenStreetMap is there, even if you're aware that these are interesting, fascinating things, or even if you help set up some of them, as I've been involved in, it doesn't mean that in the middle of a crisis you have any time or capacity whatsoever to engage those communities. So structures matter, right? They really matter. And processes matter, big time. And processes that you set up ahead of time. It's part of preparedness. Because on the ground in Haiti, I was the information manager for the initial response. I didn't look at OpenStreetMap once, right? I was the person who made the request in the tsunami for that data that came through, and we didn't get it, right? In Haiti, it came through. It's like my dreams were answered several years later, but I still didn't get to look at it or make sense of it because other stuff was going on that was not the right channel. So those things really matter in terms of institutions. And so John's question about what are the bridges you build, I think are really important. But it comes down to that openness as well, the open process piece. Because I just absolutely believe that open processes are your resilient mechanism for including new partners. Because you can't predict who's going to be involved in any phase of preparedness or any phase of response. And the only way you can be flexible enough and adaptable enough is to have an open process. But hopefully links into a community development process you were talking about.
Let me pick up on that issues of control. Right now, one of the thinkers in this area is Tom Malone in The Future of Work. I think he makes a powerful case that we're in the midst of a transformation, and that's from command and control to coordinate and cultivate. That mode is going to take different organizations different amounts of time. I can assure you that by working with certain U.S. government agencies, it's going to take them a very long time. The issues of wanting to keep hold of information, of wanting to manage all flows, is something where a hierarchical tree structure of bureaucracy is optimized to have flow up and down the tree. In many ways, the communities that are coming together are getting the trees to talk to each other. And it's getting to that happen not at the top of the tree, but at the roots. That has been a transformational process. It's going to enable far greater coordination when the people who are actually making decisions are able to interact with each other and have constant flows of open data. The ability to coordinate is largely a function of our ability to communicate. That is become exponentially greater in this internet age, and particularly as we get more geospatial data and then now more crowdsourced data coming and flowing. I think the IFRC, for instance, could have a fundamental transformation given its enormous scale at the grassroots. It doesn't have a huge hierarchy at the top. So there may be the capacity to see a large transformation. I don't know how quickly that will happen, though. We have to realize, though, that we are now in a transition stage and that we are going to have turbulence in this process.
On the Gulf, what an organization did do, based out of Louisiana, is deploy an Ushahidi mapping platform to sort of crowdsource the impact of the oil spill along the coastlines and start mapping that as quickly as possible. What they've also done, and set up a phone number that people could text to and say, okay, I've just seen that, and to also take pictures and upload those pictures. So there are many different pictures on this oil spill map that you can see that were taken by the crowd documenting that impact, as well as impact on livelihoods. And a colleague of ours at MIT, Jeff Warren, has this grassroots mapping project where literally he takes garbage bags, fills them up with helium, attaches a sort of digital camera to them, and then a long rope, and then you can basically do aerial mapping for $10 as opposed to use UAVs and satellite imagery or whatever. And he and his colleagues went down to the coast several weeks ago now and took hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pictures, aerial maps of the impact of the oil spill on the coastline, and actually uploaded those, georeferenced those, and uploaded those to that Ushahidi oil spill crisis mapping platform. So that's one thing that's been done. Another interesting point that I tweeted about just yesterday is a call for using crowdsourcing to find solutions to the issue of this oil still coming out. So apparently Innocentive is one of those major sort of crowdsourcing type companies, has already offered the government to help, but I don't know that this sort of offer has been taken yet. I think that's a big mistake personally. In terms of the gender, just when we launched the Ushahidi Haiti project to do this kind of near real-time crisis mapping, as well as a few weeks later the crisis mapping of Chile following the disaster, I can tell you that of the several hundred volunteers who participated in that, 9 out of 10 of them were women. I don't know why per se, but literally at least, if not more, 9 out of 10 of them were female students, female graduate students or undergraduate students who took to the cause. And all right, I'll take 3 more questions. Actually, just 2.
I've got a follow-up comment, if I just briefly could. Sort of thought came to me while others were talking about this institutionalization issue and the boundaries. And a lot of the work that I've been doing in disaster response has always been about how do we get this coordination to work, if you like, when there is no command and control. It's the biggest thing when dealing with the military and disaster response. They're incredibly frustrated because they want to know who's in charge and how's it going to work, right? And you face them with several hundred or several thousand NGOs in the case of the tsunami, and they're just like throw up their hands in the air and walk away to the extent that they just start operating completely independently, right, on their own. So massive challenge. The crowdsourcing, I think, we're starting to think about how we deal with those multiple centers of power, right? The traditional models of crisis response are breaking down because, in part, of the power of these new tools and the power of communities and the sheer number of NGOs. There's lots of different factors. And we're starting to think through that process. And that's possible in the disaster response phase because of the acuteness of it. It's what brings a crowd together. What makes people cooperate, and the normal institutional infighting gets pushed over, right, and pushed aside at least for a while. It's possible in that stress of the urgency and the shared need, the humanitarian need. One of my real questions about risk, disaster risk reduction or other kinds of risk reduction assessments is that you're doing it mostly without that sense of urgency. So the motivations and the institutional barriers and the institutional inertia to ignore new players is so much higher. Right? And so I think we have a tendency to glorify how much the crowd can influence because of our disaster response experience with those other challenges.
And let me add one point. We've set up an incentive structure with the way that we do grant and grant making so that information is competitive. It's a competitive advantage to have different data. It's not necessarily an advantage to have it put into the commons where we can all benefit from it and all bootstrap off of each other. That needs to get rethought.
Great, thank you. 3 more questions. The first is actually coming from Twitter. So this one is about, as there are more calls for more organization within sort of crowdsourcing initiatives, does that inevitably mean that these crowdsourcing initiatives are becoming institutionalized? And what are the sort of dangers and opportunities for that? 2 more questions. We'll take 1 and 2, and then we'll take 3, actually.
Hi, Leonard Doyle, soon to be in Haiti with the IOM. But I'm a journalist by background, and what really strikes me is that these are incredibly powerful tools, but they're also in about 80 or 90 of the 190 countries in the world. There's incredible censorship and incredible hypersensitivity about these things. As journalists, you know you can't go into many countries without declaring all your cameras. So we're going to start having people wandering around taking GPSs of things which a local suspicious cop thinks is something else. In Cuba, you can go to jail. There are people in jail today for 25 years for writing editorials. What is going to happen to these guys, these girls, when they do the good work that we all want them to do? And I think you're making a very important point about the funding of this thing, institutionalization of it. It does seem to me, as a bit of a cynic perhaps, that it's wide open to manipulation from the other side. If this sort of stuff is going to be funded by anybody, it'll be the intelligence agencies, it'll be the armies, the militaries, and all of a sudden you've got volunteers not knowing what they're really doing, being directed by people who do know what they're doing, and who don't believe in sharing or telling the truth. It just seems to me that just in the way newspapers set themselves up, they very quickly establish protocols, reputation, what have you. What's the way forward?
Thanks. I'm Fred Turner with a state agency in California, and I'll put my emergency management hat on. How would emergency managers put out an effective call to action and work with groups right now?
Yeah, I'm Roberto Rivera. I'm from the University of Bio Bio in Concepcion, Chile, the epicenter of the last earthquake. And I want to say that there are several stages for an earthquake and tsunami like this one. The first one is the fear you get out of the earthquake itself. We had a large problem with looting, which I have not been seen addressed here. And not only the looting, but the social networks that become stressed because of this, and the lack of information. And then there is the next stage, which is reconstruction, which is a long process. It has been already 3 months, and you still see rubble on the street in a sort of organized country. And especially rebuilding the neighborhoods and the social networks. So I'm very interested in this crowdsourcing idea, but how to start this thing? I have to do for my work. I have to do recommendations 3 months from now, and this I think it's an interesting idea to pose. But who does this thing? The university, the government, or whatever?
All the questions, do you want me to repeat them or repeat them? All right, so the first question is, are crowdsourcing initiatives becoming more institutionalized as a result of the call for more organization to specifically interface with formal institutions? What do you do about crowdsourcing in non-permissive environments? And what do you do with the fact that sometimes the sources of funding may come from unknown, actually perhaps sources, and you don't know that a crowd is maybe doing something that is funded by a problematic donor? How does emergency managers do an open call for action? How do you sort of start leveraging and tapping into this crowd? And then finally, I think if I understood correctly, who does the crowdsourcing projects? Who can get involved? Who can lead these projects? And I'll make sure you answer all four, so don't worry about it.
Can't wait for the University of Khartoum's Shahidi instance.
Let me take up the emergency manager question first. Do it now. During a disaster is not the time to begin building these communities. If there's an opportunity, there are a number of groups that are coming together which are more institutionalized. For instance, Ushahidi is more institutionalized. OpenStreetMap. We're getting to it is becoming a little bit more institutionalized. Stu is waving his hand at me. The opportunity is, how do we cultivate leadership to take charge of these initiatives? And sometimes this is harnessing existing social structures. Chile has always had a phenomenal, from Valdivia on, of societies of people coming together. That social structure basically becomes your leadership structure. You already have the map. How do we begin to enable those people with new tools? So it's a new communication tool, but a very familiar leadership model to them. That may be something that will take some time and will take some training, but the Ushahidi work that was done in Chile should probably come to a point where those leaders get cultivated. They train more leaders. They get trained on how to teach more leaders. That begins to build the capacity, and then we bring in more tools, and we can be able to bootstrap. There's probably also going to have to be some work from ONEMI down, and figure out how do we make more nationalized work, and that would probably fit more in the national structures there. The issues of institutionalization, so crowdsourcing is coming to a point where essentially it has an API. That's entirely within our values. We need some common method of interacting with outside world and with each other. And if we don't have those standards, we're not going to be able to coordinate ourselves. We're not going to be able to act responsibly, and we're not going to be able to act as quickly as we can with some of those tools. I don't know if it's really changing the nature of crowdsourcing so much as a maturation of the tool and coming into another space.
Yeah, on that last point, I think what's made the crowdsourcing revolution, if you like, start, and I think we're only at a transitional elbow, if you like, now, is the availability of tools that, from a wiki through to something like Ushahidi or whatever, that groups themselves can grab, implement, and start using, and build a community around. And whether that's a community of specific experts within an organization, which is often how wikis are implemented, or whether it's something much broader, like the wikis that were instituted by the University of Yogyakarta after the earthquake in 2006. But they went out into every local community and village and did their assessments and just used a wiki as a platform, but enabled collaborative editing. I think just thinking about text messages and cell phones is the wrong way to think about how we harness a crowd in a broader sense. So that will always keep emerging. I think the thing we're seeing now is that many of these communities are reaching a critical enough scale in these technologies that they need that sense of maturation, that they need that funding, those interfaces, those two things go very closely together, to be able to be sustained because of the critical mass. Because if you've got a demand every single time there's a major crisis for an Ushahidi instance or something else, right, and the technical expertise required to run that community, to sustain it, to fund it, etc., it requires some kind of institutionalization. Right? It doesn't have to be sort of a UN or a World Bank style institutionalization. It's there. But that doesn't mean that all the other kinds of things aren't going to come up. So when I made my comment earlier about needing sustainable and open processes, which was your comment and all of us are agreeing on it, is so that we can incorporate or figure out ways to link in those new groups as they come in. Right? Because they will always emerge. There'll always be, hopefully, a university that decides it wants to get a group of people together to do this. I would hope that every group in the World Cross is going to go down this path. It seems a natural thing for them to do, right? And adopt the leadership models and do the change, but that'll be piecemeal. It'll be one community at a time, one leader at a time deciding they want to do this, right? As well as the top-down piece. So I think it's just going to keep evolving. I'm not sure I've hit all the points, but I think that's where it's going to have to go.
Start with the institutional question, then move on to emergency management. how institutions are trying to bring this in or adopt it, for me, really comes to mind the idea of social media marketing. You know, and I was really involved in that way back in 2003 or 4, and the thing that troubled me was that institutions saw that as another channel to push out. It was a marketing, it was a push channel. And I think a lot of people think of crowdsourcing kind of that same way, rather than how do you bring this into the core? How does it affect and change the operation? And that's a big problem, is if you get a big set of crowdsourced data, and you bring an institution, and you're like, well, what do I do with this? You know, great, that's all I've got. A classic example is helped the government of Seattle when it was transitioning last year said, okay, let's open up ideas platform for all citizens to say, what's your idea to make the city of Seattle, Washington better? And collected all of these great ideas, and much to my chagrin, the problem was that, okay, now what do we do with them? And if you don't have any way to say, okay, that's a great idea, can you get started on that? Can you instigate that in your community? Or that's great, I'm going to get back to you on it. If you don't have those institutional processes around any of this stuff, it's there's no point, and you're gonna lose any interest or momentum you might have created. That's what usually happens. It gets worse. If people are like, you never got back to me, or I went all this trouble, I've got 10,000 data points and you're not even using them, it can cause real pain, not just a lost opportunity. For emergency management, I totally agree, do it now. I think that I'm a big believer that emergency management is one of the biggest areas that all of these approaches, these technologies can really take advantage of. I ran through it really fast, but one of the examples was in Australia, the brush fire housing scenario. That was right at that point, the government said, look, who's got extra housing for fire victims, who needs it, et cetera. But it's much more important to get prepared and to say what are plans that we can use things like Twitter, social networking, and alternative communication channels in the event of a crisis. And in that case, this is the thing I really want to stress, is trust, trust, trust. It is so important, especially when you have more mature governments, because they have legal liabilities. A lot of them, and there are not policy frameworks and legal frameworks to deal with okay, I'm collaborating with a citizen on solving a problem. It's really hard. Don't shy away from it. I mean, look for those solutions, but that's a big area to improve on.
I've spent the past year and a half talking with emergency response organizations, most in the US, about this exact problem, and that legal liability is a massive issue. The reason why 911 and 311 systems don't integrate with things like Twitter is that there's a responsibility to act, right? And to document, et cetera, et cetera. And even 311 systems, many governments are not really interested in rolling them out because of what that means. The number of police departments I've talked to, they said, yeah, we keep an eye on Twitter, but there's no way in the world I'm going to sort of acknowledge directly or interact directly with that group because of those issues, as well as the other issues about trust and so forth. But I think Neighborhood Watch is an interesting point about getting started with those communities, because they are communities, they're organized, and they have a chance to make use of tools and other things in a different way. I wanted to address, I realized none of us had talked about the sort of unsympathetic regime issue, which I think you raised very well. There's a couple of, this is complex, of course. I think if you can't do traditional disaster risk assessments, management, et cetera, in those communities, you've got no hope of doing anything more. So there's a baseline level of openness and engagement that's required for any of these processes to work with any community. So that needs to change clearly in many places, but it needs to go there. But I think that the trust, security, encryption kind of aspects, these are new tools, and there's lots of new ways that they're being used. Right? So, for instance, if we rely on SMSs in emergencies or in lots of other scenarios, they're either monitored or the networks are actually shut down, which is what happened in Sri Lanka, for instance, several different times, even in a quasi-open society. As a colleague of ours, Sanjana Hatatua, regularly writes and blogs about his citizen media initiatives. But I'm encouraged by the fact that even in places like Iran and elsewhere, there are citizen media that are emergent. I think the problem is the ability to trust and make sense of that data is lower because of the anonymity required. Right? So it requires a different kind of threshold for how to judge it, how to deal with misinformation, how to deal with all the other problems that we worry about in an open scenario like Haiti. Right? But is so much more problematic. So I think we have a lot of experience to gather in more open scenarios before making use of that learning from the citizen media community, I'll put it, the organizing community, about both channels and transports and mechanisms for getting information back and forth, but also for how to judge and trust and collectively decide on things.
And let me take up the intelligence question. Intelligence, one of its roles is to create an asymmetry in the type of information between two sovereign states. That asymmetry becomes a strategic advantage. It only works because you're able to protect that information and hold it in a black hole. And most of the time, you can't get very much out of, I'll just take the example of my own government, and trying to get data back out can be a royal pain. Crowds are set up, and particularly if we are able to set ourselves up in a little bit more institutionalized way, of keeping the information out in the open. That isn't really as compatible with intelligence as I think we might fear. Having that data out in the open means that everyone can coordinate. This also provides a different approach to doing stability operations, reconstruction operations, because instead of having all the information flow up a hierarchy and never come back down, and everyone, how many circumstances have we seen where two NGOs in the same town decide to build a school for the same population at the same time? The information isn't flowing back down. How do we begin to look at having a much more open scenario where crowdsourcing is providing that open commons for the information? Yeah, I bet some intelligence agencies will probably provide funding. If it stays out in the open, the damage would probably be mitigated. If it stays as something that the crowd's information is now pulled back out and we don't have controls over the way, and we don't establish licensing, even if it's open licensing over the data to ensure that it stays open, we could create some problems for ourselves. Yeah, this is definitely part of the ethics question.
A couple points on this just from me. In terms of the open call for action and how do you start interfacing, got a call from the city of San Francisco a couple of weeks ago, interested in the folks who are involved in emergency preparedness and response, saying we'd like to use Ushahidi and try this out. We've got some trained citizens in the city of San Francisco who already know what to do in terms of being the first needs assessments type folks. So, like Nigel said, then these communities can come around together around a tool like the Ushahidi platform. You put it out there, you open it up to maybe a few people to begin with, you have them test it out, give you feedback, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, to keep in mind that platforms like Ushahidi are really only 10% of the solution. They are not your project. I mean, you folks know that because you're trained experts. Other civil society groups and so on who decide, all of a sudden they want to do election monitoring or something else using Ushahidi or disaster response but have no background in disaster response, all too often think that the platform, the technology is going to be the whole solution, which is really obviously not the case. In terms of who does the crowdsourcing, that was a good question. In the case of Chile and the use of the Ushahidi platform, it was the University of Columbia in New York who basically trained themselves around the platform and did near real-time crisis mapping, and who have been back and forth to Santiago to train anybody else who would want to be trained. They just spent 2 weeks saying, we'll train anybody. So they trained some university students at San Sebastian, I believe, and now are interfacing with a group called Acción, I think, sort of an umbrella group of organizations of about 40 NGOs to train them in terms of how to use the tool. And I think we'll see a little more of that, because in Haiti, it was, again, like John mentioned during his presentation, it was Tufts University, graduate students and undergraduate students who sort of came together, used the tool. So they're, pretty up to speed on the technology, and since then are training other organizations, such as in Guinea is happening right now, and work with OCHA in Iraq to set up an Ushahidi platform. So definitely don't underestimate these university students who really get the technology and who have deployed themselves. I think that's one thing to keep in mind. And then in terms of crowdsourcing in non-permissive environments, I think that's when you start talking with the folks who are experts in digital activism, folks who are actually doing sort of political activism using these technologies in places like Cuba or like China or Burma, what have you. They tend to know their way around things. Okay, 3 more questions. We've got 1 over there, Chris, 2, and 3. Perfect.
Hello. I'm just interested in your thoughts. I thought it was a really good point about the carrying capacity. And what are your thoughts on projects that extend past that carrying capacity. I mean, disaster response, can get a whole bunch of people around it. Risk assessment, I mean, I'm relatively new to this area as well, but the thing they're really into is this exposure database. They want building level detail of the entire world to run these risk assessments. How do you scale crowdsourcing to that? And if the answer is money or paying people, how does that work without sort of cannibalizing some of the goodwill, total costs, et cetera, et cetera? Chris Holmes, OpenGeo.
Hi, John Schneider, Geoscience Australia. I'm not sure how much of a question I have here, but I'm fascinated by the discussion. I am responsible for a program that on the one side is trying to provide open information for risk assessments for emergency managers in the community at various scales. And on the other hand is working to meet the needs of national security for addressing risk to critical infrastructure. Now, the information in both cases is almost there's a 99.9% overlap. On the one hand, on the emergency management side, there's a drive to make it open, accessible, be inclusive, communicative, and on the other side, it's everything but that. And I guess I'm just interested in your comments on how you bring these two communities together and show that they're not necessarily, I suppose, a threat to each other. Thanks.
I'm Katie Filbert, and I work on OpenStreetMap. And this is a question for Patrick and the panelists: is well, if you guys are talking about being prepared, in Haiti, the 4326 shortcode was set up after the fact, albeit quickly, but wouldn't it be great to have a shortcode set up in countries ahead of time, something widely known, say like in the U.S. being able to text to 911 that would be useful not just in an emergency but also there are some times where it's I see something I'm not comfortable overtly calling 911 but would be comfortable discreetly texting them, and so is something like that being worked on or what?
Questions. So in terms of the carrying capacity idea, how do you scale crowdsourcing to get sort of building level data across the world? How do you have the disaster risk, disaster community, and the national security sort of communities work together, given that the information overlap is 99%? And then how about shifting from reaction to preparedness for shortcodes and other types of technology?
I can try. The carrying capacity, you're talking about a grassroots organizing effort. You're not necessarily just talking about crowdsourcing here. This is a distributed leadership model from Marshall Gans. How do we begin to set up those communities by building leaders on the ground in each of those places, and then using those leaders to train more leaders, and then using those leaders to get the people to actually begin to do those building footprints? OpenStreetMap has been very successful around the world at getting those mapping parties together. It would seem like it would be a natural partnership to work on that and then set up a map so that you have open data. The data is available for risk assessment. At the same time, it's available for corporations and others to use it for mapping applications and for people who are users of OpenStreetMap to simply access the information as they navigate through their local environments. I think as far as the security issues and going back and forth, this is something that we're grappling with. My work with the National Defense University puts me headlong into a very similar problem domain. I don't think we've found answers for this problem yet. I see a lot of struggle going on in very old-fashioned information assurance mentality of give nothing away except for these couple of exceptions. That doesn't work in the concept of building up either a comprehensive model of risk or in the response. So if we're going to, there's a point at which the thing that we're grappling with is that many of the government processes that we're encountering around information assurance is about eliminating risk rather than managing risk of information flows. And we haven't yet moved from that mentality of wanting to have zero risk to a point where we're willing to have acceptable risk for certain outcomes. Oh, sorry, short code? Yes, we're working on it. I can't talk in public about it, but we're working on it.
Yeah, your open process.
Because it's dealing with an organization, that is a problem.
The challenge of a short code is that every community will use their short code in different ways, basically. Right? And so the short code that might be set up in Senegal, I'm imagining a hypothetical, and it's being discussed, a GSM association set of short codes that are established, et cetera, et cetera. They'll be used and adopted in different ways, and that's great. You're completely right, it has to be used ahead of time. But communities will form and use and adopt for the purposes they choose. No one expected Twitter to be used for what it was used for, right? Unless it's overly controlled, in which case it won't actually be used. Right? So there's a tension and balance there. I'm somewhat skeptical. I think they need to be set up and staffed, but I think they'll surprise us with how effective or not they are. On the national security issue, I think what we'll see is that debate will slowly become irrelevant. Right? Looking back to my repeated batterings on the door for information from the US government, for instance, during emergencies and other governments, several years ago it started as a "you've got to be kidding me," right? A flat no, to in Haiti to quite open responses quite quickly. And that's a changing attitude to what classification means. I hope that I don't walk into a building again with a printout of my PowerPoint and not be allowed to take it out again because it got classified in between, right? Which did happen to me during the tsunami response, quite literally. This was the outbriefing plan for the US military to leave the tsunami area, and I couldn't take it away from the building. So an example as well is the US Abraham Lincoln, after the tsunami, refused to hand over information about downed bridges, even what transport flights they'd done in response, the bathymetry that I'd asked them to put together, et cetera, et cetera. It just wasn't part of the policy how to request it, even if it was only marginally classified, even if it wasn't actually secret in any sense on SIPRNet or NIPRNet or whatever. What happened then was that I put out a call to action at a meeting saying we need to understand the bathymetry, what's going on, all the port entries down the west coast of Sumatra, et cetera, right? We need help. A week later, this lady turned up who'd sailed her yacht down the west coast in intermediate time and built up full charts of the entire coastline and just handed me a CD with everything, including the names of all of the community organizers in every village that they stopped at along the way that was along there and what they needed, et cetera, et cetera. So I think one of the things that these tools do, aside from being a platform for co-option, which I doubt, is that they're actually a threat to that closed nature. Because the critical infrastructure database is very quickly becoming an open secret, if you like. Not because it's the same database, but because it's being replicated externally. And I think part of the challenge is how to engage that open process, I'm sure is one you're facing every day. And I'm sure I had a witty and wise comment about the first question, but it's not here. What was the first question? Yeah, I mentioned the concept of a multipolar world of disaster response, and I think the same is true for crisis assessment. In terms of these tools enable lots of new emergent actors. Right? The challenge of that is that I'm not going to pay attention to anything that I can't easily access. If I'm trying to make decisions, if I'm within one of my own environments, be it institutional or a crowdsourced tool. So the concept of interoperability or information sharing, APIs, data standards, etc., become absolutely even more critical for these loosely organized tools than they perhaps even do for institutions, because I can't possibly aggregate all that information or make sense of it or even have any new piece be relevant unless I have a way to channel it and include it into my process. So that for me is actually incumbent on this newly emergent consortium, the tool makers, the users, etc., to realize that their tools embody and enable or discourage certain uses, and to be very deliberate about what they're doing, right? So some tools get built on top of other tools for specific audiences, be it law enforcement or other places. That's great, right? But ultimately, when we talk about ethics, when we talk about data security, we talk about interoperability, they're very deliberate choices that are being built into these tools that need to be carefully considered, right? Because they do make a huge difference down the line by anyone who adopts them and uses them. Sorry.
No, I just want to amplify that a little bit, and I think that if you're going to try and make the case to be more innovative, crowdsourcing, open, that the community of people trying to do that usually do it on a values argument, that we need to be more open or we need to do more this. But the instance of saying, giving a call to action, really tying it to a goal, like our institution wants to do this. Okay, what's the best way to go about it? And a lot of big institutions, the defense community as well, is starting to say, wow, it'd be better if we were more open. We would accomplish more. And I think that management of institutions and lawyers of institutions got in a really nasty habit of thinking that their only job was to eliminate risk. But it's on two sides, to eliminate risk and maximize opportunities. And so figuring out how to make the case around that and say, tie the thing you want to happen to a goal or a call to action, and I think this debate's going to get more and more. It's the winner's clear. So.
I'd actually say that there's something that big institutions or small institutions can really do when they're engaging to change the way this debate rolls out. Because either through grants and money, as John and others mentioned earlier, or through choices about how data is published, say the open data, OpenGov, Gov 2.0, or the World Bank's open data, you're choosing about how this unformed or emergent communities interact with you, and by default with each other. So you actually have the choice about whether you're challenged by these new actors that come in and leave you in a difficult position in the future, or whether you effectively challenge them back and say, hey, right, here is a way that you can work together, even if we don't work together properly, fully with you now, but here is a seed of an oyster, if you like, a pearl, that you can start building around. I'm not claiming that institutions are the best place to put that out there. Right? I think there's different models of engagement, from dictating or from designing. Anyone who's looked at interoperable data specs for geodata never wants to go near that again in an emergent community structure. Right? Simplicity, ease of process, ease of data, etc. is the key word. But there's a chance to make that happen rather than be challenged by the results of 20,000 organizations all using different standards, all trying to figure out how to work together.
Let's take a look at grassroots organizing for a second to answer some of the one other question here. Grassroots organizers are generally, many of them are organized against institutions that are impinging on the rights of people. There's a long history of activism around this. It is only now that we're beginning to look at how does that become a feedback loop, so that we can look at how do we organize institutions in order to help communities as well. One thing that Marshall Gans had, I was lucky enough to actually be in his class, the organizer that that was on the screen from Brett's presentation. And this goes right to Chris's question. When you're organizing, you have to answer the question, I am organizing X to do Y. Who am I organizing to do what action? Now, organizing someone to do disaster risk assessment, let's face it, is not all that sexy. It may take a little bit more than that. But we are talking about mapping their space. We are talking about actually making them aware of the difference it could make in their lives by having a map, which might be used for disaster risk reduction. It might be used for many, many other things. You can organize people to do something that's going to be more beneficial to them as a whole by having a map that can be used for multiple purposes. What I would say is we're at a point now where we have to figure out how do we get those leaders on the ground and set up that distributed leadership structure so that we can get people to provide the information up, and at the same time change our institutions so that we can have a feedback loop. The information could go down and in, and throughout the process add value to the information. That is the incentive structure. if you can add value to the information that flows into an institution from the crowd will continue, and you give the information back to the crowd with yet more, leaving it better than you found it or you got it. You will create the incentive structure for the crowd to continue feeding back, and you'll also feed the crowd's capacity to do higher and higher level analyses.
Just a quick replies of my own in terms of the preparedness and so on. I think one of the take-homes for me in Haiti is the need for some kind of SMS code of conduct, which I know I've had a number of conversations with these folks about. I think Haiti and other sort of disaster response operations recently have shown the power of mobile technology and SMS and so on. But we have a number of other standards in the humanitarian space. I mean, that's phenomenal. Can we tap that? Can we tap this distributed cognition and embed some simple sort of, micro tasks, as I called them last night, sort of geolocation and that, sorry? Recapture was one of the examples I gave last night. How do we actually tap that? Can we embed these in some of these massive multiplayer games? And this is something that Brett and I, with his group in Seattle, Revision Labs, are seriously looking into. And I know a couple other groups like Crowdflower are already tapping the idea of using Farmville and so on. So this may not be the solution, but it's something that I think needs to be tapped in one way or another. We were going to close now, but I see you have a question. So we'll
I was just going to follow on what you were just saying is like I work not only on OpenStreetMap, but I'm also involved with Wikipedia, and there are people who are like just care about writing articles, but then there are people who tend to the garden and revert vandalism and things like that. And some of these people are younger, maybe high school or whatever, and it's kind of been turned into a game where it's the more you do, it's the more reputation you get. And I don't know, I mean people creating tools where it's just click click, but it's some of those tasks have been turned into that sort of thing where.
Great.
So.
I think it's an exciting space to explore further.
Yeah.
Thanks for your comment. All right, I think we'll draw this to a close. Please come and talk to the panelists as well and help me thank them for their presentations and answers.